All right. Well, things are about to get real because our next panel features two leading officials from law enforcement, and they're going to discuss the successes and challenges of investigating and apprehending cybercriminals. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Tonya Ugoretz. And Tonya is the Deputy Assistant Director for the Cyber Division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Michael D'Ambrosio is the Assistant Director of the Office of Investigations at the U.S. Secret Service. So a lot of experience there on chasing down cyber criminals. And our moderator for this session is Judith Germano. She is the Distinguished Fellow at New York University Center for Cybersecurity, adjunct professor at the NYU School of Law, and founder of Germano Law, LLC. She's also Third Way Cyber Enforcement Advisory Board member, and in her previous life, she was Chief of Economic Crimes for the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey. So come on up and get us going.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us, and also we at NYU are honored to put on this event together with Third Way and the Journal of National Security Law and Policy, and I really have to hats off to the folks at Third Way who masterminded such a terrific program today. We spent a lot of time this morning talking about the problems and the significance of catching a cyber criminal. So for our afternoon start here on our session, I would like to begin with a little good news. So if I could ask each of you to please share with us some success stories of where it really is working, this admittedly challenging problem of catching cyber criminals.
Sure. Boy, it's really not often that I get asked to start with a success, and it's not doom and gloom, so I welcome that opportunity. I think there's a few areas where we've seen successes from the FBI and law enforcement's perspective over the past few years. One is just the rapidity and kind of the getting used to how we partner with individuals from not only domestic law enforcement, but also international law enforcement, the private sector, private researchers, academia, to combat specific cases of cybercrime, especially the really complex cases where we're trying to increasingly target an entire organization rather than individual criminals in order to achieve maximum effect. So one recent example I can think of where we partnered with Secret Service and others was in the MethBot Eve investigation. This was a case where it had to do with fraud related to digital online advertising. So as you know, the internet, while it appears free and open, companies are also in the business of making money, and much of that revenue comes from clicks on advertising. This was a global scheme in which ad clicks were being fraudulently generated to the tune of more than $30 million in losses to companies who were paying for ads they thought were being clicked on, but that were never actually viewed by human eyes. This is where we saw a lot of great international and domestic cooperation out of our National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, which is built to bring together academia, industry, and law enforcement in a trusted environment where information can be shared more rapidly. In a nutshell, this led to a concerted effort to see how can we actually bring down this entire organization behind this activity, and that was composed of technical analysis with private sector companies to look at how the activity was being perpetrated, preparation of indictments, work with our assistant legal attaches overseas to identify the subjects we were indicting and track their movements, identification of the technical infrastructure being used, so domains, servers, et cetera, with the final result that that entire takedown plan was coordinated with private sector industry researchers in advance. So at the time that we were ready together to go and arrest folks overseas, at the same time, domains were being sinkholed, servers were being seized, bank accounts were being seized, so that really you had the effect of the entire operation going dark simultaneously. And that's really the type of cooperation that it can be time-consuming, but the more instances of that we have, the better we get at it, the more trust we create among all those entities that are engaged, and I think the more types of successes on that scale we'll have.
So I would agree with Tonya. I think, right, what I've seen is sort of the biggest success is that everybody at this stage of the game is at least come to understanding that this is a problem, right? That network security is a problem, and it's not essentially law enforcement or government's going to come in and solve this problem. Everybody sort of has to have ownership to it. I think once you see that, you're starting to see a lot of successes. I'm going to bring up a case down in Atlanta. There was a ransomware attack against one of the municipalities where both the Secret Service, the FBI, but also CISA, the new Cyber Information Sharing Organization, was involved in, where we were able to come together, one, to mitigate the instance down there. And so we used CISA to come in, help to mitigate what was going on with the network. Secret Service was in there. We were there actually for a protective nexus. And so we were in there initially and we were able to get some of the initial sharing and initial gathering of digital evidence. The Bureau had already had a case on that particular version of ransomware and had some subjects that they were already interested in. And by coming together, we were able to quickly identify the individuals, provide the evidence, and get those individuals indicted. And the city of Atlanta was essentially be able to come back up and functioning in a much more rapid environment. And this also encountered us working internationally with our international partners. And so when you look at this here, that's really how you're going to solve this particular problem, with a whole of government and really a whole international approach.
And would you say that we are getting better at the communications and building those relationships internationally?
I think from a service perspective, we definitely are. We're reaching out more to our international partners. We have the National Crime Agency embedded within the United States Secret Service. Secret Service has agents embedded in the NCA over in London. We also have agents in the Netherlands and in Germany. And now we're looking to expand in South Africa along with the FBI to combat business email compromises that seem to be stemming from that environment.
And we see that cooperation improving too, and it's really critical to what we're doing. I mean, there's really very little now that's either purely domestic or purely international when it comes to cyber activity, whether that's financially motivated or coming from a nation state for other purposes. So those international relationships are really key. For us, we rely heavily on our cyber assistant legal attachés, which we currently have in about a dozen countries and are looking to expand. When representatives of foreign governments, and particularly foreign law enforcement, or justice departments come and meet with Director Wray at the FBI, there's almost not a single time that goes by where they don't request having a cyber ALAT there in the embassy, because it just enhances the speed of the information sharing. Sometimes it helps us provide assistance in terms of capacity building. And as you touched on in your question, it's really those human relationships that are key. I think a lot of times with cyber, we focus on technology and speed and ones and zeros, but coming from a law enforcement perspective, you know, the nuts and bolts of what we do is really based on long-built, hard-earned relationships of trust, and that's exactly the same in this realm.
Since you brought up ransomware, let's jump to that for a moment. It's been a very serious crime internationally. McAfee reported that ransomware has doubled in 2019, and we're seeing a horrible spate of attacks on cities, as you mentioned, and municipalities, and also in the healthcare sector, as well as other organizations. But there where there might be limited resources to address the problem, or where public health and safety is a serious concern. What can we do to help stop this spread of ransomware and to better protect those who are being hit by ransomware attacks?
Well, the prevention really starts with some of the basic cyber hygiene that we talk about all the time, whether that's enabling two-factor authentication or ensuring that you have secure offline backups of data, which really minimizes the ability for really these extortionists to hold your data hostage until you pay the ransom. This will probably, it's going to be something we say repeatedly, but it's really, again, something we're trying to tackle by engaging the private sector and multiple levels of law enforcement as well. We don't necessarily have the data that shows that the incidents of ransomware are rising. What we do see is that those incidents are more targeted against victims that have the highest incentive to pay. So as you mentioned, hospitals, healthcare sector, municipalities, those who, if their data is held ransom, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny and incentive to pay quickly, because it can also have a public health and safety dimension. And we also see the amounts of ransoms that are being demanded going up, so that ultimately the impact to those victims is higher. One of the things at the Bureau we've done to adapt to this is look at how we organize our investigations nationwide against some of the most prevalent ransomware strains. So for example, with the SamSam ransomware that was prevalent from 2015 to 2018, hundreds of victims, tens of millions of dollars in losses. The city of Atlanta, a national port, being among the most wide-known victims. We had victims in the United States in almost every state and in the jurisdiction of almost every one of our 56 field offices. So rather than having 50 different investigations open nationwide to respond to those victims, we've really kind of nationalized how we look at these cyber investigations. So we will designate one field office as the expert in either a certain actor, like an APT-10 or APT-28, or a certain prevalent ransomware strain. And so while individual offices may be responding directly to victims, collecting evidence, that all feeds into the one office that's responsible for managing the investigation and then working with headquarters in order to develop kind of the national strategy for disruption. So in the SamSam case, that was really effective and enabled us to centralize our work not only with the victims, but with foreign partners who also had victims in their countries. We worked with cybersecurity researchers to help trace the cryptocurrency that was being used. We work a lot with the intelligence community then as we're identifying the potential people responsible for the activity to try to determine, was it truly criminally motivated, or did it have some sort of nation-state nexus? And in that case, we were able to successfully identify 2 Iranian nationals who we assess were working for personal profit on their own time to perpetrate that activity. And by indicting and outing them, fortunately, there have been no instances of use of that ransomware since those public indictments.
And I think for the service, so we see exactly what Tonya sees on that is, one, we see the ransomware attacks targeting groups that really where there's an incentive to pay, whether it be the healthcare sector or whether it be your emergency services in your municipalities. It creates an interesting dynamic between whether you should pay or don't pay those particular instances, right? I think the other tying fact to that is that those 2 particular groups, municipalities, healthcare sector, generally are not devoting a large volume of their budgets to IT security, right? They're not high profit margin type of industries, and so if there's some place that's going to not receive the resources, it's generally IT security. So it's something to be said that, right, at the end of the day, all of us have to take accountability for our networks and do sort of the basic cyber hygiene type of steps to protect us. That'll make the environment better for all of us. As far as the Bureau strategy, as far as the Secret Service strategy going after ransomware, what we've done with the FBI is where the FBI strategy is to put out a ransomware variant to one of their particular field offices. We've sort of put out the same, but where we're going to focus on Secret Services, focused on cyber-enabled complex frauds, right? And so generally speaking, your ransomwares are going to provide some sort of, if they're doing it for the money, Secret Service is going to go after and try and follow the money and bring that subject matter expertise to the investigation. And where we can, we'll partner with the FBI, which is what we did during the city of Atlanta, and I think that will make for a much more successful approach, right? The key, though, is that as organizations are going forward and they're making a decision whether to pay or not particular pay, law enforcement needs that information in order to follow those individuals. Consider it just like no different than a kidnapping, right? If somebody were to kidnap somebody and somebody decided to pay, you would report that to law enforcement, and law enforcement would take the action necessary to find the culprits of it. And that's really the same type of thing with ransomware.
But ransomware and some other types of cybercrimes that we see sometimes present a conflict between law enforcement's desire to actually investigate and catch the cybercriminals versus the enterprise to just get back to its operations and maybe wouldn't want to disclose to the government that they're paying cryptocurrency to someone somewhere in some country that maybe they shouldn't be sending funds, for example. And what can we do to overcome some of that tension between the victims just wanting this thing to be done and out of their systems and law enforcement's significant interests in stopping it so others don't continue to be harmed?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is just because you pay the ransom doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the decryption keys and you're going to get your data back. And so you have a risk when you go ahead and do that. The second thing is by paying the ransom, you actually only encourage the individuals to do it again. If I'm a bad guy and I know that I've been able to get paid for ransomware, it's going to encourage me to do so again, right? And so one of the things that you really have to consider as you're going through sort of that dynamic is, I don't know that they're mutually exclusive, right? Law enforcement right now is not going to come out and say, you cannot pay the ransom, okay? However, it seems to me you would want to do it in conjunction with law enforcement in order to try and target the individuals that are perpetrating the crime, right? There may be some information in there that we may be able to help you. By coming to law enforcement, we may be able to help you find the key, right? There are instances where law enforcement has the key. We have collaboration with Europol and No More Ransomware, where there have been instances where they're collecting that type of information and people have been able to acquire that without paying the ransom. So I think where law enforcement comes in is it's going to be a company's decision whether they're going to pay the ransom or not. My recommendation would be is not to pay it without consultation with law enforcement.
I also think it's often a misnomer that there's a choice between mitigating the activity or contacting law enforcement and enabling an investigation. We work very closely with CISA and their Hunt and Incident Response Team, which is responsible more for the mitigation and prevention side of things, whereas FBI is coming in with tools to investigate, collect evidence, ultimately lead to attribution, and hopefully conduct some operations to prevent future victimization, either of that particular victim or of others. A lot of times we are side by side at working with a victim, so both CISA and FBI, CISA's HURT team, FBI's cyber action team, they're for different purposes, but they're working cooperatively with each other and with the victim company to achieve both of those ends at the same time.
So it seems, though, again, ransomware as well as other types of attacks, sometimes victim companies are focused on what's happening in their system, and they're afraid that if they do reach out to law enforcement, so you can go ahead and try to stop what's happening and catch the perpetrators, they're concerned that they will lose control of the situation within their own systems, and that law enforcement then will be in their systems, maybe looking at more than they are comfortable having law enforcement look into, and also might direct their decisions and options so that they feel like then they can't, for example, pay a ransom or they'll get in trouble. How can we overcome some of those concerns as to why you're not going to get a phone call in those situations, potentially?
Well, so everything we do in those instances is voluntary in cooperation with the victim. So that's often a conversation at the outset as we're engaging with the victim company and often with their general counsel about the types of information that's most valuable to us, which is typically logs of activity and things like that. We're not there on a fishing expedition. We're not going to run in with raid jackets and make it a very noisy response. As was noted on one of the earlier panels, we have a long history of treating victims as victims, and so we're certainly not going to engage in activity that feels like or presents itself as additional victimization of the company.
What I think is, again, completely agree with Tonya. We're going to treat the victim as a victim, but the only way to do that, and for groups to understand that, is start to look at your organization and prepare, right? How you prepare is go through tabletop exercises within your organization where you can address these particular things. If you're addressing it during the middle of the incident, it is really already too late. One of the things the service did, and we just did it last week here in New York, is we put on an incident response seminar. And we partner with the McChrystal Group in order to do that because of McChrystal's philosophy, leadership philosophy, and their team of team concepts, where they really talk about trust, shared consciousness, and empowered execution, right? And the importance of all that is to come together ahead of time and understand that we all have a role to play in this particular environment, right? And we can discuss all of those things that you talked about, Judith, ahead of time. When you come in, what are you going to do with our networks? What are the expectations? What's the information that you're really looking for, right? If we can nail that down ahead of time, then I think if you do become a victim of a cyber incident, one, you'll know who to call. You will already have built trust, and you'll already know what steps and actions that you need to take place.
So you mentioned the SamSam indictments, the perpetrators of the ransomware attacks on Atlanta and a number of about 200 other municipalities and organizations. That was an example of what we talked about this morning of the so-called naming and shaming, which has some benefits, though naysayers say, what's the point? These are two guys who are never going to come to America. They're never going to face prosecution. Putting it out there maybe confirms that they're not going to go on vacation somewhere where we could nab them, and also perhaps reveals certain law enforcement tactics. What's the response to that? Why do you do it?
So I think there's a number of reasons to pursue indictments. I mean, one is that states have a responsibility to investigate and prosecute crimes of all types, and cybercrime is not any different. I think it's a misnomer, again, to say that the individuals that are indicted never see a court of law. We do have a number of instances, and as was noted earlier today, one just last week of indictment and extradition. And in the methbot example that I mentioned earlier, I mean, we had 3 Russian nationals extradited from 3 separate countries to the United States to face trial, 2 of whom have pled guilty and one of which is still awaiting trial. So I don't think we can just kind of blanket say these individuals will never see a court of law. But we talk a lot about norms in cyberspace, and law enforcement actions and indictments are one way of signaling what is counter-normative behavior. What do we consider, not only to be criminal, but to be something that we want to signal through a speaking indictment, or one of the more detailed ones you mentioned, that really lays out the type of activity that as a government and a society we assess is beyond the pale. So there's, kind of the legal reasons and, the idea that hopefully it does have some deterrent effect. And the National Cyber Strategy actually singles out law enforcement actions as one instrument of national power, one among others, that has the effect of deterring activity. But it is only one, and we acknowledge that I think use of any instrument of national power is most effective when it's combined with other instruments as well. So indictments and sanctions and demarches and maybe other activities such as cyber effects operations. There are many instruments in the US government toolbox. I think we focus on indictments often because they are one of the most publicly visible, and the US justice system has a level of maturity such that we have been able to use indictments as an instrument of national power against cybercrime. But that is not the only tool in our toolbox, and so I think we're most effective when that's combined with others, and that the impact of indictment shouldn't be looked at in isolation. But I also want to say I think there are other salutary effects of indictments in this realm. They signal to our international partners the types of activity that we're seeing, and they often are a necessary first step to get our international partners on board with publicly recognizing and condemning similar types of activity. Indictments open up the use of other instruments like sanctions, and we do see some deterrent effect that I can't really get into in this forum, but I think it's an impact that will be seen over time as actors look at the information that's being publicly called out and what effect that has on their colleagues and their ability to work, travel, and do the other things like you mentioned.
Is there also, though, some consideration in terms of how much detail you put into an indictment? For example, a speaking indictment of people you don't think will be extradited to the U.S., on one hand might help to inform victim companies in the U.S. of the MO of the crime, show that the law enforcement does actually have a good handle on what's going on, and perhaps to help for further investigations or for victims to protect themselves. But on the other hand, is that sometimes giving up some of your special tools that might hurt the ability or hinder the ability to prosecute others later or to investigate others later?
So what I'll say is this, right? There is a decision to make whether you have a public indictment or whether you keep an indictment sealed. And to me, it's a tactical decision based on what your objectives of the investigation are, right? And so you may have a public indictment where you acknowledge that in that particular instance it's more geopolitical than it is investigative. And there may be a greater need to send out a speaking indictment in order to send a signal that says, hey, we understand what's going on here, and we're not going to tolerate it, even if it means that the individuals at hand will never travel again outside of that country or never see a courtroom in the United States. Right? Secret Service, we look at our cases slightly differently because generally speaking, we're not targeting sort of nation state actors and those kinds of geopolitical considerations, right? And so we're generally going after transnational organized criminals where we may decide from a tactical decision that we're going to wait, because generally speaking, criminals are targeting our financial system for the money. And generally speaking, if you're targeting for the money, you're going to travel somewhere nice and spend that money, right? And that'll open up some opportunities that potentially will allow the service to arrest those individuals in collaboration with our partners and bring them back to the U.S. where we can gain more valuable intelligence, right? Anytime you're looking at an indictment, there's always that sort of conversation that has to take place with the U.S. Attorney's Office as to the benefits and the detractors to doing so. And in some cases, it's even higher than that because, again, as I say, it's more geopolitical.
And sometimes that lying in wait approach can take years and looks like the government's not responding, but you've had some success with that, right?
We've had lots of success. It's sort of patience, and again, eventually these individuals generally will travel, right? And so the longer you wait, you time it, and then you can potentially arrest those individuals and get greater information as to their activities.
When you arrest them, you might not arrest them in the United States. Presumably, they're going to, for example, Drinkman to Amsterdam, or Burkhoff, the case was discussed this morning, to Israel. What do we do then? Because it's not always so easy to bring them back.
Well, that does depend on the country to which they've traveled, and we certainly have cooperative relationships with many of those countries, and ideally, through that patient approach that Mike mentioned, they travel to a country where we are able to have them arrested and extradited. But we also know that in particular with the Russian-speaking cyber criminals, Russia in particular has exhibited a pattern of activity where they will try to interfere with those extraditions from third countries. And they've exhibited a pattern of doing that through, for example, filing their own extradition requests, which are often spurious, exerting political pressure on the third country, advocating for bail or for release on medical grounds, and then helping the individual flee the jurisdiction. So that pattern certainly is not helpful, and so I think we also work to raise the awareness of countries that might find themselves in those circumstances to know what kind of tactics to expect. And we're very grateful when those countries do exhibit, kind of the fortitude of, pushing back on those efforts.
And I would imagine raising awareness and calling them out on those kinds of issues is helpful to help overcome some of the tension where a country may not be inclined to extradite. Right? Are there other things we can do to help encourage more smooth extradition processes?
Listen, I think primarily it's raising the awareness. I think also it's just having cases that are done well and essentially have solid information that when you make the case to your foreign counterparts, that it allows them the ability to assist the U.S.
On cases that are done well, it's sometimes ridiculously hard to address the issue of attribution in a compelling way in cybercrime cases, and that seems to be a major hurdle to prosecuting cybercriminals both in the U.S. as well as internationally. Crimes can be committed where it looks like it might be a victim, actually, who's committing the crime, and when you're talking about that on an international stage, it can be rather nefarious with significant concerns. What are your organizations doing to improve our attribution capabilities?
Listen, attribution is a challenge. I think that one of the things that law enforcement does is we look at many tools. I think really what it takes is good investigation efforts that combine both technology, right, and the use of sort of open source resources that's going after these particular individuals. It's technology is both helpful, right, and it also can be a detractor to what law enforcement does. But what I will say is this: if you get a good investigator, he will be able to overcome some of these attribution techniques. We've seen it time and again because at the end of the day, most of these criminals, they will make mistakes, right? And you sort of follow the good leads, you will find out a way to identify them.
I agree. I think some of the traditional law enforcement approach and law enforcement methods really are incredibly well suited to the attribution problem. I mean, we often use, I think, specific words when we're talking about cybercrime like attribution, but really it's about what we do on a day-to-day basis, regardless of what type of crime it is, which is finding out who's responsible and holding them accountable. And I want to push back on a notion that was mentioned, I think, in the first the interview today. Attribution doesn't only occur after an attack has been committed. I mean, the law enforcement and the intelligence community are attributing activity even when it is so-called left of boom. So there's a lot of preparatory activity that's undertaken by cyber actors as they're looking to gain access to networks, conduct reconnaissance, the activity that takes place before the actual really disruptive or destructive activity occurs. So efforts to attribute that activity, to find who's responsible and ideally what their aim is so that we can stop it in advance, those things are happening before even information is stolen or some sort of destructive activity occurs. So it's really, we're working on attribution on an ongoing basis and ideally as early as possible so we can prevent the worst impacts of the activity. It is becoming increasingly difficult, especially as we see the blurring between nation state and criminal actors. Very difficult often to tell who's who, or depending on time of day, who's working for what purpose, whether it's their day job in an intelligence service or at night perhaps earning a little bit of money on the side. And the tools that are being used by the nation state and criminal actors are blurring as well, with less differentiation between what used to be the more sophisticated activity that was purely the domain of nation states with the tools that are used by criminals. Some of that is deliberate obfuscation. A nation state doesn't often have to use the most sophisticated tool. They can use an openly available tool that's also used by criminals because it's just as effective and it helps hide the hand behind the activity. So that's where I think from the FBI's perspective, it's helpful for us to have authorities against both the national security and the criminal activity because we can often move fairly seamlessly between looking at both types of actors.
An area of cybercrime where victims, both individuals and corporate, are really crying for more help in terms of catching the perpetrators is that of business email compromise, which you had mentioned earlier. The losses from that crime are skyrocketing. We are seeing hits by the minute, by the day. In the US, it's more than $10 billion in losses and more than $26 billion globally. I know you've had some successes in addressing this kind of crime, but what else is being done, and what new tools or what do you need more of to address that serious threat?
Listen, I think, the service is putting a big emphasis on business email compromise. The big thing is, I think, education that, one, right, businesses have to put into play we talk about multi-factor identifications, the same thing a little bit with business email compromises is put some checks and balances within your organizations as to when somebody receives money, some internal control on when you transfer it, how you transfer it, and really look through some of those attributes so that you can identify something that's out of place. These individuals, these perpetrators of this crime, they do their research, right? So they understand the internal workings of the organization. Many times they'll do their research into who the CEO is. They'll know when they're traveling, right? And so making it very difficult to reach somebody and confirm these types of transfers. The key is getting to law enforcement as soon as possible. The quicker you get to law enforcement, the quicker law enforcement can go ahead and start to put into place the financial kill chain working through FinCEN, right? And so a lot of times what ends up happening is organizations will call, but they'll call later in the process. And at that stage of the game, the money has already made multiple hops and is outside the ability of law enforcement to take any particular action.
Yeah, totally agree with everything Mike said. And just to put a point on the importance of that speed in reporting. So in 2018, IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, instituted a recovery asset team. So this team is focused on trying to recover those lost assets before they're truly lost to the victims. So in fiscal year 2019, with just the incidents reported to IC3, which we know is just a small fraction of the cybercriminal activity out there, there were reported losses of about $375 million overall. Of that, the recovery asset team was able to recover for victims $293 million of that potential $375 million loss. So that's more than 78% recovery rate. And that's when those crimes are reported quickly. So say within about a 48-hour period, they will work crimes reported, later, but it just gets harder then to recover the assets. And lest you think that's just, large victims and big dollar amounts. I mean, we're talking about victims such as a woman who fell victim to a compromise scheme whereby she thought her lender for a mortgage that she was trying to acquire was contacting her, and actually it was a scheme, and she ended up giving her $56,000 down payment for a home to the perpetrator of this scheme, and that was her entire savings that she had actually inherited from her parent that had recently been deceased. The recovery asset team at IC3 was able to recover that money for her. Or a municipality in Alaska that responded to fraudulent invoices to the tune of $2.9 million. The team was able to recover $2.6 million of that $2.9 million, and that was the difference between that municipality having to file for bankruptcy and not. So it really does have a real impact. That financial fraud kill chain has been hugely successful, and it just really underscores the importance of reporting to law enforcement.
And do I understand correctly that that's something that's really been a development over the last couple of years, or year or 2 years, of strengthening how quickly to claw back those assets?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely has been the case. I mean, it's proactive work by FinCEN, and I think it's also law enforcement agencies taking a proactive role, getting the word out sort of to the offices, and so that everybody has a point of contact to call. Secret Service now has the Global Investigative Operations Center at our headquarters that has a point of contact and one individual that sort of oversees the entire group. So that as these things come in, he's working with the FSISAC so that we have all the institutions essentially on speed dial in order to convey, hey, the victim, here's what occurred, and see if we can't recover the money. I think what's really different in this is law enforcement generally is always looked at as far as arrest and prosecution. In this particular instance, we're really looking at recovering the funds first and then going after the individuals and the perpetrators behind it.
What can we learn from Operation Rewire, where there were 281 arrests, 74 in the U.S., and then also in Nigeria, Turkey, Ghana, France, Italy, Japan, Kenya, the U.K., and Malaysia, right? And I believe that there was state, local, national law enforcement, as well as obviously our international partners. How did something that big all come together, and how do we make sure that happens more often when needed?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a good news story because just the number of countries involved, like you mentioned, was enormous, and it just illustrates the amount of global law enforcement cooperation. But on the flip side, it's a bit sad because it was called Operation Rewired because it was the follow-on to Operation Wire, which had happened just the year before and was not on quite the massive scale, but still was a large number, I think nearly 100 arrests worldwide and similar seizure of funds. So the fact that just the next year we had an even larger operation with hundreds of criminals arrested and even more millions of dollars seized is great, and yet just also illustrates just the scale of the problem.
Do you feel you have the tools necessary to do your job, or is there more that can be, if not a total overhaul, perhaps some tweaks with regard to the ability in a constitutional way, and appropriate with warrants, to access computers remotely in an investigation, or to have wiretaps for real-time capturing of communications, those investigative techniques?
Yeah, I mean, the Secret Service has some authorities as it comes to our critical systems protection. And when we go out and we can investigate, or not investigate, but we go out to different sites in our protective mission, right? We can work with the organizations to monitor networks as part of Title 18, 3056. Right? As it comes to investigations, organizations right now themselves are not allowed to consent to law enforcement coming in and monitoring their networks like we would a particular wiretap or consensual phone call, right? In different instances, those authorities could be helpful to investigations.
Obviously, we could spend a full-day forum on balancing law enforcement and privacy and security, which we don't have time for because I'm about to turn it to questions in just a moment, so audience members get ready for that. But for those important discussions that need to be had, who are the right people to be engaging in that from the law enforcement, and who do you want to be having those conversations with, or your agencies have those conversations with?
To me, as we talk through sort of the balancing of security, right, and privacy, right, it's got to be everybody involved. So you need the U.S., the citizens of the right, to understand what they're looking at here, the government, law enforcement, all to come together and decide as a whole, how are we going to balance, right? How is law enforcement going to conduct their role and secure our citizens while maintaining some balance of privacy?
I have more questions, but I want to make sure if there are audience members who have questions, we give you a chance. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Mary Cavaney, and I work for the Global Cyber Alliance. We've had the benefit of working with both of your agencies, so I appreciate that partnership. We have a free cybersecurity toolkit for businesses and elections on our website, should that be useful to you. But my question is about human trafficking. And I used to co-chair the task force for human trafficking for New York State. And I'm wondering if either one of you have an opinion about the 2 acts passed last year and whether that has done, has it brought any pain to the traffickers, or has it driven the criminal activity to the streets as some are afraid of? Thank you.
So for the Secret Service, we don't really engage in human trafficking investigations. The only way that we would really be involved in that is if there was a financial fraud associated with the group, and we would work it in partnership. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer to your question, ma'am.
Other questions? Yes?
Hey, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about ransomware. It seems like the advent of some new technical capabilities set the standard for how it works. The pseudo-anonymous payment network combined with semi-autonomous malware equals ransomware. And as much as you want to shift the norm to say don't pay for it, it's just not going to happen. It's the right decision for the person that's affected to remediate the incident at the lowest cost. So flip that on its head. What is the technical capability that your two teams need that would change that equation and set it back to, way that things would work?
So first, I don't think that law enforcement at this stage of the game is saying don't pay, right? I think the answer is if you decide to pay, that is an organizational decision, right? I think what we are saying is that you should conduct that decision with sort of the input of law enforcement. Generally, if you're going to pay, there's going to be from a financial perspective, law enforcement is going to be able to follow the money, okay? And so I would make the recommendation that you want to find out who's behind it, and so you should do that step with law enforcement. As far as the technical solution, I don't know that I would say there is a technical solution to ransomware. I think as long as malicious actors understand there's a vulnerability, they're going to capitalize on that vulnerability. I have never seen a technical solution that eliminates sort of crime, right? I mean, you can go out and buy ransomware on one of the dark web sites and have nothing to do with it and send it out in an exploit kit.
Yeah. So the question is, like, if you had 100 wizard kind of engineers working for you for a year, what would you have them build that would make your life easier so that ransomware was less of a risk?
So again, I don't think that solution exists, right? Again, most of ransomware, when you take a look at it, is if you have your own cyber hygiene basics and your your IT systems have some resiliency to them, you're less likely to be hit by ransomware. Again, right now, what is ransomware targeting? They're targeting groups and organizations, right? They're not targeting the major financial institutions with ransomware. Why is that? those institutions have tight IT security controls, not for any other reason that they've decided to make an investment and can afford to make that investment. Right? We understand that municipalities and hospitals, they don't necessarily have the margins to make that huge investment in that area, right? But we need to work towards those types of solutions. I don't think you're going to find, if you give the Secret Service and the FBI all the engineers in the world, I don't think we're going to, eradicate ransomware from the face of the earth. I personally don't see it.
So we don't need a room full of wizards, we just need a good backup system that is offline and protected from the ransomware?
I wouldn't turn down the wizards, but
Okay, that's the workforce issue that I want to get to.
Yeah, I agree with Mike, and there are different entities that have different pieces of this. There are those, technical experts who really deeply understand the ransomware and how it's being engineered and how it's working. We, along with Secret Service and DHS, recently hosted a ransomware summit in Pittsburgh where we brought together the different federal agencies, international agencies, private sector companies, including insurers, and those who are engaged as a business in negotiating with the perpetrators of ransomware to try to gather all the expertise amongst those different parts of the community that are trying to combat this and understand what are the latest tactics, how is it evolving, what's been effective, what are the motivations. And so I think that was a start. And I think by continuing to bring together that community of people who each have a very different kind of optic into the problem, that's going to help us very much.
Other questions? Yes, I see 1, 2, 3. There, 1, 2, 3. Okay. As the microphone makes its way, I just want to ask if a victim wants to call for help, how do they know to call the FBI, the Secret Service, local law enforcement? Who do they call?
They should call law enforcement. It will make its way to us, regardless of who they call. We do encourage reporting to IC3 because that enables us not only to enable the appropriate response, but also capture those measures and statistics that we've heard earlier are so important. But it's really about who an organization or an individual has that relationship and familiarity with.
I completely agree. I mean, I think at this stage of the game, right, everybody should understand that whether you call state and local, whether you call the FBI, or whether you call the Secret Service, we will then figure out who is best situated to work it, or we'll end up working it collaboratively because we all have some equities within the investigation.
Just in relation to cybercrime involving state actors, do you find it preferable to do direct contact with partner countries directly rather than going through international agencies like Interpol or the other international organizations that the US has a foot in, or do you prefer to actually go through your legal attaché network?
It really depends. We work both bilaterally and through multilateral organizations, so it's really kind of case dependent.
I mean, for the Secret Service, the FBI really has the lead on state actors, and so we would work through them with all of our partners.
I think there's a question here.
On the theme of ransomware, I've noticed in news articles and some of the cases have made public how ransomware is being increasingly used in combination with other tactics, either as a exiting strategy or to provide a measure of camouflage for some other tactic. Have you noticed any other combination tactics like that, like a DOS attack covering for exfil or something like that?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the attack that most commonly gets mislabeled as a ransomware attack was NotPetya, which was the Russian perpetrated attack that was, I think, is still the single costliest cyber attack in history, which really was masquerading as ransomware but had a more destructive purpose. But I'm not aware of other similar types of combinations like you described.
And there's another question that maybe if you just move to each person as it's being asked. Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to find out who we call with the Forbes article that says that of 29 different Android phones, they found 146 pre-installed, unremovable vulnerabilities in them that Google has not at all said is not true. So I don't know who to call about that because they're stuck in Android and they can't come off the phone.
Can you go say again, sir?
Forbes just put out an article that pre-installed into phones are 146 different spyware and other vulnerabilities on the phone from the 29 different vendors.
You gotta call your OEM, like HTC or
Well, that does-
Google doesn't do it, it's someone else.
There's the woman behind the NYU sign there, the question. Yes. And then the gentleman behind the speaker next.
Thanks.
No, yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. One of the things that in the financial services sector that's been very helpful is that I think as the regulators are becoming better educated and they're conducting investigations of financial firms, they're starting to pull together information reports that highlight best practices that they've discovered through investigations, and quite frankly, practices that are not so great and that should be avoided. I've seen the reports that have come out of the FBI, but I think what would be very helpful is as the data comes together to possibly see if you can start highlighting what you see as good practices that firms are employing, because we often just focus on what's gone wrong in investigations, but we also need to think about what has been done right, because there are practices that are effective and that we should be thinking about. Because this goes back to the themes that we're hearing through each panel about collaboration, information, education. But I think you all have a lot of data. And if you can harness that data, not just in terms of information by numbers, but information, the qualitative stuff, I should say. And what are best practices and what are practices that can be avoided. That would be really helpful. And just so you know, FINRA has done that on a regular basis, and it's something to look at.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Thank you.
And I think that could be done even on an anonymized basis, since companies won't want to come out and say, hey, I was almost a victim, but look at my good security, because then they don't want to invite an attack. But if it's anonymized, I think that's very helpful. Sir?
Thank you. Dustin Volz with Wall Street Journal. Tonya, you talked a little bit earlier during this great panel about Russia's efforts to gum up the works on extraditing cybercriminals to the United States from third-party countries. And you mentioned the Alexei Burkov. A lot of those tactics, filing sort of competing extradition requests or using the political process you mentioned. But one that you didn't mention was in the case of the Alexei Burkov extradition, Russia actually detained a Israeli-American who was flying through Moscow on a layover, and she's been sentenced to 8 years. So I wanted to ask to you, just how concerned is the FBI and the administration about Russia's apparent willingness to engage in sort of more overtly coercive efforts to block or get in the way of U.S. extraditions of their cyber criminals, and is there sort of a clear plan to address that type of stepped-up behavior? And then related to that, on the Burkov case, he was initially detained in Israel in 2015, so it took, I believe, about 4 years, over 4 years for him to come to the United States. Is that simply because of the drawn-out legal process, or were there other factors at play that led to such a lengthy appeals process? Thank you.
I can't comment on that specific case, but in general, I'll restate that certainly it's concerning to us when there are legitimate pending extradition requests and other actors engage in activity that tries to interfere with lawful extradition through the means that I described, whether that's spurious competing requests or political pressure. We do see that pattern of activity, and we are concerned about it.
Since I'm not restrained and I only know publicly available information, it is a very troubling tactic, and I think part of help is calling them out on what's going on and making sure it's more aware, since for years that the extradition discussions were sometimes more silent and not always as publicly discussed. So it's a great question. Sir?
Hi. I was doing a second master's in cybersecurity at NYU School of Engineering, briefly, abridged, and I was allowed by a professor to meet with the U.S. Secret Service cybersecurity team briefly, but something happened. But I have a question. How relevant is the fact that there is a dark net, and how dangerous it is? We should not be bothered by it, or should we not be aware of it, the public, and the underground economy? Is this kind of curious about that? Darknet, and the FBI, SCS.
So I mean, what I'll say is this: Secret Service doesn't work investigations by way of just looking at the dark net. Should we be concerned that there's a dark net out there? Absolutely, right? We're going to look at and we're going to target the most prolific cyber criminals, and try and address the problem that way.
So as I mentioned, our approach to disrupting cybercriminal activity is really focused on the key criminal service providers, and much of those services are marketed in places like the dark web. And so we're talking about development and delivery of malware, infrastructure, the financial services, the cash-out schemes to actually monetize the cybercriminal activity. So the fact that those services are kind of marketed, kind of almost like a cybercrime in a box, to someone who can essentially just buy those capabilities and employ them at very low cost is certainly very concerning, and that is an area of focus for us.
So our last question right here.
Hi, I'm Francesca Rios. I'm from the Manhattan District Attorney Office's Cybercrime unit. I have a question. You've talked a lot about successes. I have a question about to the extent to which you think the statutory framework that we have now is sufficient to accomplish your agency's enforcement goals. I'm thinking specifically about the legislation that empowers us to eavesdrop. Companies that provide telecommunications are compelled to provide the infrastructure for that, but companies like Apple, who are, facilitating much more of my communications than a voice-to-voice phone call is, are not compelled to provide that type of infrastructure. So I was wondering if you could talk on that type of point.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, some of the challenges with the access to information are key to what law enforcement is doing. Obviously, the District Attorney's Office of New York has taken a very leading role in this topic in of itself. I think the first question that has to be answered for us, right, is should law enforcement have lawful access to data? Then the second piece of that question is how does that really occur, right? And so Secret Service, both the Secret Service and the FBI, based on where we need, are supportive of sort of lawful access discussions, and those are taking place right now within the U.S. government as to how to facilitate that, what it will look like, and those types of issues.
So these are not easy issues on our own soil, and then when you make it an international concern of how to investigate and prosecute cybercrime, it becomes all the more difficult. But I am heartened by your good hard work and your information that you shared with us today, so thank you so much, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.